I'm just making my way up the stairs, and ahead of me is a beautiful stained glass sign, and it says Royal Agricultural Hall. Well, the sign and indeed the hall date back to the 1860s. This place is now the Business Design Centre here in Islington in North London, and today it is playing host to Sustainable Foods 2026, an event all about the food chain and how to make it more sustainable.
It's a joy to be bringing you the 5th Annual Sustainable Foods Conference here at the Business Design Centre in London.
As I say, it does cover the whole food chain. For obvious reasons, we're just going to concentrate on the farming end of all that. So let's start with Henry Dimbleby. He's speaking here. He's the author of the National Food Strategy, produced for the last government, co-founder of Leon, the fast food restaurant chain, and co-founder of Bramble Partners, an investment firm which he says will back businesses that will change the food system for the better.
For farming, it's fascinating. I'm going to start where you wouldn't expect me to. So, on appetite-suppressing drugs. So I think for farmers, if you're in the commodities game, people eating less is a problem. And then on the sustainability and the climate side, I think there is an urgent need in this country to think differently about the way in which we pay farmers to produce the benefits that we want them to. So sustainable food, secure food, good soil. And we have the government who are going to relaunch their ELMS programme. We have bits and pieces of green finance, so water companies paying people not to put nitrogen into rivers. But fundamentally, I think we need to move to a mass balance approach, similar to what we have in fair trade, where there is a premium for farming in a certain way. We need farmers to shift much more quickly towards regenerative, and the way to do that is to create a premium working with some of the big companies here that gets paid to people who are making commodities.
There's one sort of basic problem with that, which is define regenerative. What you might mean by regenerative and what somebody else at this conference might mean can be two very different things.
100%, and the question is, who does that? At the moment, you have this crazy system where you've got brands, marks, which I think are important. So Soil Association have a brand. There are some people who get the premium through the customer, but most people do not have the headspace to think about that. And so more broadly, regenerative farming, what do you have? You have things the government will pay you to do, which change, uncertain, move from scheme to scheme.
And are different in the different parts of the UK, because
Yes.
Here in England we have ELMS, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is closed at the moment to new applications, will open for small farms, we don't know what that means yet, in June.
Yes, so then you've got in the commodities market the Nestle's, the Ferreros, those kind of people who all have their own standards, their own tick sheets. And so the question is, who is it that makes these rules? And I think you need to have farmers cooperatising and then pre-competitive efforts from companies to define standards on which there's a premium. How do the farmers make sure that they get enough money for that? That has to be about cooperatisation. You know, you cannot negotiate with a huge multinational unless you are doing it in some way in a cooperative fashion.
Henry Dimbleby there. Well, the Farming Minister, Angela Eagle, is also at this event. She agrees that our food system isn't currently working for everyone and change is needed. I asked her where farming fits in.
Well, what needs to change in farming, firstly, is that we need to farm more sustainably in an eco-friendly way so that we can make the best use of our resources. We want to make farming as profitable as possible, which is why we've got the Baroness Batters report, and we'll be making some announcements about how we're going to implement that. We've got the farming roadmap, which will set more of a direction that farmers can perceive. And so ideally, what we want is a farming system which produces lots of fresh food in a sustainable way, which we can get to every part of our society. So I think that they've got a huge role to play in trying to make sure that we change our food system for the better.
In England, though, the government schemes that we have when they're up and running are public money for public goods. They're not about food production, are they?
Well, they are about farming in an environmentally friendly way. And I actually think that given climate change and the resilience issues, we are more likely to be able to farm in that way if we make our farming more sustainable. So that's pushing the whole system, not just to think about bulk production, but to think about farming in a nature-friendly way that will preserve the fertility of our soils, that will make it less likely that we have catastrophic flooding if we get better management of our river systems. So it's trying to shift to something that's far more sustainable.
There's a lot of talk at this event about regenerative farming.
Yeah.
Some farmers and equally some consumers see that as a bit of a catch-all, even a greenwashing term, because there isn't really one definition of what it actually is. Where does it fit into the government's thinking?
We have to make certain that we farm in a way that fits in with the environment rather than destroys it. And the more that we learn about how that is, the more we're going to be pushing the system with our farming monies to execute that change. I don't want to get into a big row about the definition of regenerative farming, but I'm going to say something like this. We need to farm in a more holistic way. That means that we can preserve for future use the fertility of the land. And so that means that some of our older ways of doing things aren't going to work. We need to, for example, bear down on water pollution that comes from the beef sector and the dairy sector. And there are ways we know we can do that, and we want to help the sector shift to doing that in a more effective way.
But some of those changes, as farmers here will point out, add cost. So who's going to pay for that?
Well, I think that if you've got a whole systems transformation like this, we've got to have more debates about this so people understand the connection between farming and farming profitably and affordable, highly nutritious food. We've got a system at the moment that doesn't deliver those potentials to some of our poorest areas. So having access to locally grown vegetables, for example, or fruit might be a good way of dealing with some of that. And we're going to be doing some work to see if we can put those two things together, which is why the Batters Review, one of the sectors that we've announced we want to take a particular look at to begin with is horticulture.
The Farming Minister, Angela Eagle. As you can probably tell by the noise, it's coffee break time, and I'm just in the back of the queue for a cup of tea and hopefully a biscuit. A lot of people here are from the sustainability end of the big companies. A few farmers dotted around, and I've just bumped into Phil Hambling from ABP.
We're a fresh meat processing company, so we're one of the largest beef and lamb processors in the UK. Principally, our core business is around providing own-brand products to UK retailers.
In that context, how important is sustainability?
It's probably number one on the agenda when we're talking to customers. They're seriously interested in also being a connected partner in helping driving sustainability, particularly at farm level. And what we're here to talk about today is the work that we've done through PRISM, our program for improving the sustainability of red meats, and the 350 farmers that have been on us in that journey.
What sorts of changes have those farmers made to try and make red meat more sustainable? Because there are going to be people who are just laughing at this point and saying, look, it's fundamentally unsustainable. It's not really that good for us in large quantities. We need to be moving away.
We see a lot of well-educated influencers coming out with big statistics about numbers of cattle in the world and that sort of thing. At least a third of those are in India, where they're mostly vegetarian. So clearly this is a much more complicated picture than some of those reductionist arguments would play for. And for us, for our farmers that have been involved in it, we're in our second round of assessments right now, working in partnership with Harper Adams. And some farmers have made some significant changes, changing their breeding patterns, switching up their agronomy, much more use of multi-species swords, reducing fertilizer use. And for the farmers that have changed, have made a significant reduction in their emissions as well, somewhere in the order of 2 or 3 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of beef.
What about the price in all this? Will your customers pay more?
Well, what we've seen is perhaps a maturity within a good number of brands actually willing to invest. But what they understandably want is also to be able to capture that benefit for the customer. They want return on that investment in sustainability terms. So now we have seen very, very significant investments from a number of different brands in this space, and we're happy to be partners to some of those.
When it comes to consumers, there's a lot of talk, particularly here, about things like regenerative farming, about sustainability. How much of that is actually meaningful to a shopper in the sense that they'll be happy to pay a bit more for it?
I think in general terms, the average consumer's understanding about sustainability is very low. But to be fair, I rely on aeroplane manufacturers to do a good job every time I get on an aeroplane. And I think a lot of consumers want to rely on those brands and the food industry to do the right thing for them. To be able to navigate all that complexity on a label is very, very challenging. And explaining why doing a good job deserves a premium is also very difficult for consumers. But there's always going to be room for premiumization. But if something premium becomes mainstream, there's no more premium. And I think there's something about how we help farmers, help them on the journey of sustainability, helping improve their farm resilience, and hopefully helping secure the economic resilience at the same time.
I'm standing on the balcony now, overlooking people mingling and networking in the break. It's amazing just how many people are at this event and who comes. We've got CEOs from Tesco and from Morrison's, the CEO from Muller, Managing Director of Arla, the President of Danone, and standing next to me, Andy Cato from Groove Armada, who's also co-founder of Wild Farmed and a farmer. Now, Wild Farmed pays farmers a premium for regenerative farming, and then it sells branded products, but it also sells ingredients to other food producers. So what is regenerative farming? Because one of the criticisms of it, which we've heard today, is it can mean anything.
Well, I suppose at its most basic, it's farming that leaves the ecosystem better than it finds it. But to build awareness and build agency amongst our customers from the beginning, we wanted to be very clear about what we meant by that. And so the first iteration of that was our Wild Farm Standards, which I think was aside from the organic movement, the first UK set of standards for regen arable. And then from that, we always wanted to move towards an outcome-based framework, because ultimately we want to say to our customers what's happened to nature, what's happened to water, what's happened to carbon, and of course what's happened to farmer outcomes, because if we haven't got good farmer outcomes, there's nothing else to talk about.
So it's sustainable in that it's good for the environment, good for biodiversity and so on, but it has to be financially sustainable, which is where the premium comes in.
Yeah, well, the premium question is a good question, isn't it? I mean, ultimately it's about redefining what we value. If you look at the Dasgupta report or any number of reports that report on nature loss, they assign a value of nature in the trillions of dollars when it's going in the wrong direction. We've assigned value to nature on non-food producing land via BMG and other such schemes. What we've singularly failed to do is value nature in food producing systems. And our whole mission is to bring nature and food production together. And a lot of the last 6 years has been developing a nature metric that's affordable and scalable for arable systems, because ultimately farmers can only respond to economic incentives. They're right up against it financially speaking. So if we don't create economic incentives for nature, for water quality, for food quality, then how can farmers possibly deliver them?
And who's paying for this? Is it the consumer ultimately who's choosing to spend a bit more on a wild farmed loaf than a different loaf?
I think, well, at the moment our customers pay a little bit more, and it's about how do we build a framework, a holistic economic framework in which farmers have these economic incentives to truly regenerate the ecosystems in which they're farming. Ultimately, I think as a society we have to redefine what we value. So the Treasury needs to move beyond language of subsidy and recognise that actually supporting farmers to regenerate land and nature, build resilience, is probably the best return on investment that any government can make. In the meantime, we have to find solutions ourselves. And so one of the things that we've done, which I think is unique in grain markets at least, is to build a segregated supply chain so we can measure the nature, the water, the carbon, the grain quality impacts on the field level. We can then keep that supply chain segregated, and that allows us to get everyone along that supply chain to participate. And we have to collaborate on this. We can't put all this on farmers. There are no losers in this. You know, we can have a resilient and abundant future. We just need to choose to do it.
Andy Cato, and that's it from us here at Sustainable Foods 26. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.